Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. What I want to talk to you guys about today is these nasty algae blooms that so many of us get on our lakes. A lot of people are afraid of fishing in algae, and it's really not a big deal if you understand it. As you guys know, most of you know, Tim and I both live up on Clear Lake in Northern California. I guide out here on the lake. And for Western fishermen, everybody knows Clear Lake gets these really bad blooms. This is nothing. We get really bad blooms. But when you're a guide, you don't have the option to just come and go, right? You can't just go to another lake. This is where we fish. So we've been forced to learn how to fish around algae blooms. And what I've learned is that they really are no big deal. People think they're a big deal. They're not if you understand them. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a genius when it comes to these blooms, but basically from what I understand, we've got a handful of kinds of algae that impact us. We've got green algae, we've got blue-green algae, which is pretty nasty, smells bad, can be toxic. And then we've got golden algae. Now we don't have golden algae, but that's another algae that impacts lakes. Basically, there's a misunderstanding in bass fishing that if there's a lot of algae in the water, all of a sudden, you got clarity like this over here, and the next thing you know, a bloom hits and you have no viz at all, that you can't catch fish, or that it's impacting the fish, or it's bad for the fish. And really, from what I can tell, it's not a big deal. The only one that really impacts fish is golden algae. How do you know if your lake has golden algae? Every fish in the lake is floating on the surface. Somebody, probably not you, already called the news. There's a news crew standing next to you talking about the giant disaster. All the bass are dead. It's over. That's how you know you got golden algae. So if that hasn't happened, you're good to go. Blue-green algae, green algae, whatever other kinds there are, no big deal. Here's what you need to know if you're going to fish in a lake with algae. First, algae is literally a bloom. So in the middle of the day, hottest parts of the day, that bloom will open and rise up to the surface. That's why you get this thick stuff on top. In the evenings and at night, that algae closes up and sinks back down, gets lower in the water column. So that's why when you go out first thing in the morning, the algae is not so bad. Then all of a sudden midday, it's terrible. It's because it's literally a bloom that will open up and rise to the surface. So how does that impact you as a fisherman? First, if you know you're headed to a place with a bad bloom, fish early. Early morning, you've got great clarity. You can throw topwater, you can throw anything you want. As that bloom starts to open up, come to the surface, you're gonna lose your visibility. You're gonna have to start adapting. Now, how bad is that algae to fish in? Depends on how thick it is. Algae wants to rise to the surface. So most of the time, even when it's thick and nasty, just a couple feet below the surface is normal watercolor. That's what you've got to understand. Algae most of the time is impacting your fishing zero. Does not matter at all. The only time that it's really going to impact you is wind. Wind and big waves will churn up the water and will sink that algae, get it to go deeper, mixing the water. Now, when that happens, algae gets harder to fish and you need to adapt. So if you're on a jig bite and a worm bite and a crankbait, typical summer stuff, and in the morning you're able to get away with throwing a white crankbait and a brown and purple jig and a green pumpkin worm, in the afternoon, you should be able to do the exact same thing. But if that wind comes up and starts churning that algae in the water, starts getting it lower in the water column, then your fish really are losing their visibility. What you want to do at that point is just adapt color. You don't need to leave. The fish haven't left. They still live there. They still feed in that water. It's not a big deal. But you need to change your colors. I would lose that white crankbait. I'd go to something with some Chartreuse in it. Just something that they can see easier. For the worm, go dark. either Junebug, black and blue, something like that that'll stand out in that dark water. For your jig, you go to your black and blue jig. You just avoid the browns and the green pumpkins when that bloom is really, really severe. That really is all you have to do. And then lo and behold, the next morning when you get to the lake, you're back to normal, clear water, no big deal. Algae is not a monster problem. You just have to understand that because the bloom is changing so rapidly, the fish aren't always adapting. You know, bass that live in murky water lakes feed no problem. But when a bass in a clear water lake 2 hours later is in murky water, then you need to adjust colors and things like that to help them find the bait. But in terms of actual fishability, catching fish, catching big fish, algae doesn't matter at all. Sometimes it'll smell a little bad, sometimes it looks a little bit bad. Go to the lake anyway, have a great time. It's not hurting you, it's not hurting the bite. If you can keep that in mind, you can get some great summer fishing when nobody else wants to be on the water. I hope that helps. First thing is going to be the square bill crankbait. The square bill is a compact bait, fits that general bluegill profile where it's a short, stumpy bait, pretty round. More importantly, it moves very quickly, very erratic, something the bluegill do different. This may be a better day than I think. This lake is starting to look pretty stacked. So we're going to run down lake. I don't know how well you guys can see, but basically I've got a big point over on this side and an even larger point there on the left, and then the dam down there in the background. And I think I'm gonna focus around those first couple of big points, although I gotta admit this stuff is looking pretty darn good. But we're gonna start out down there. We're gonna focus on some of that stuff and see if we can find some fish on the little bit of structure that is in